Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Thomas Reeves and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2024. The cold air bit at my face as I stepped out of my car at the Turkey Run State Park trailhead. My golden retriever, Rusty, whined excitedly from the back seat, his breath fogging the window. I hadn't been back to this part of Indiana since my college days, but the rolling hills and dense forests of Park County still held a familiar comfort. At least, that's what I thought before everything happened. "Ready for an adventure, buddy?" I asked, opening the door. Rusty bounded out, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed the ground around the gravel parking lot. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, that distinct autumn scent that always reminded me of new beginnings. I needed this trip. After my divorce from Claire 3 months ago, I'd fallen into a rut of working too much and sleeping too little at my software engineering job in Indianapolis. My therapist had suggested I reconnect with nature, find some solitude to process everything. Turkey Run seemed perfect, rugged enough to feel remote but with established trails and campgrounds. Safe. I secured my backpack, checked my trail map, and made sure Rusty's leash was tight. We'd be hiking to one of the backcountry campsites near Sugar Creek, about 4 miles in. The park ranger at the entrance station, a weathered man in his 60s named Earl, had eyed me strangely when I mentioned camping overnight. "Not many folks stay out there this time of year," he'd said, scratching his gray beard. "Especially not near the old Cabot Hollow area." "Any particular reason?" I'd asked. He'd shrugged. "Just gets mighty cold, and strange sounds carry in these canyons at night." Then he'd stamped my permit and waved me through. Now, as Rusty and I set off down Trail 3, those words rang in my ears. I shook them off. Earl was probably just an old-timer trying to spook a city visitor. The trail descended into a ravine, where massive sandstone formations towered overhead. The path snaked between them, following a stream that whispered over smooth stones. Rusty trotted happily ahead, occasionally looking back as if to make sure I was still following. The forest grew denser as we moved deeper into the park. Sugar maples, their leaves brilliant crimson and gold, created a canopy overhead. Moss-covered logs and mushroom clusters dotted the forest floor. By midday, we'd reached a series of ladders and wooden staircases that ascended through a gorge known as the Devil's Backbone. The name seemed melodramatic in the cheerful autumn sunlight. "Careful, Rusty," I murmured, guiding my dog up the wooden steps. He was usually sure-footed, but some of these drops were steep. The trail eventually opened into a wider path that followed along a ridge above Sugar Creek, offering spectacular views of the water cutting through the valley below. Around 3 p.m., we reached the junction that would take us to our campsite. A small wooden sign pointed down a narrower trail marked Cabot Hollow, 1.2 miles. I checked my GPS to confirm the location, but the signal flickered strangely, showing us half a mile from where we should be, then jumping back. Battery interference from the ridges, probably. "Let's stick to the map," I said to Rusty, who was busily investigating a hollow log. The side trail was less maintained, with branches occasionally scraping against my pack. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as we descended into thicker forest. The silence was palpable. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Just the rhythm of our footsteps and Rusty's panting. It took another hour to reach the designated campsite. The small clearing sat about 50 yards from Sugar Creek, which flowed lazily by over smooth stones. A fire ring of rocks marked the center of the site. I set up my 2-person tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and organized my provisions while Rusty explored the perimeter, nose to the ground. I was securing the food in a bear bag to hang from a tree when Rusty suddenly froze. His ears perked forward and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it? Is "Boy?" I asked, following his gaze across the creek. Nothing moved among the trees on the opposite bank, just shadows stretching as the sun lowered behind the ridge. But Rusty wouldn't relax. He stood rigid, hackles raised, staring at something I couldn't see. "It's okay," I soothed, rubbing his neck. "Probably just a deer." But he wasn't convinced, and his unease was contagious. I found myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement. The air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the normal boundaries between things had thinned. I shook my head. That was ridiculous. I was letting Earl's cryptic warning and my own isolation get to me. I finished setting up camp and gathered firewood before the light faded completely. The temperature had dropped considerably, and my breath formed small clouds in the air. By the time I had a fire going, the forest was draped in darkness. Rusty finally settled down beside me as I heated a dehydrated meal over my portable stove. "Just us out here," I said, offering him a piece of beef jerky. He took it half-heartedly, still glancing occasionally toward the creek. We needed this, right? Peace and quiet. But the quiet felt oppressive now. In the city, true silence was impossible. There was always the hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, the white noise of civilization. Here, when the fire stopped crackling momentarily, the silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. I'd told my sister Amy where I was going and when I'd be back, so someone knew my whereabouts. Still, I felt suddenly, intensely alone. After dinner, I brushed my teeth at the edge of the clearing, spitting toothpaste onto the ground. The beam of my headlamp caught something white among the fallen leaves. I bent down, pushing aside the damp foliage, and uncovered a small animal bone, too large for a squirrel, too small for a deer. It had been picked clean, but something about it disturbed me. I let the leaves cover it again. Back at the fire, I tried to read on my e-reader, but couldn't focus. Every snap of a twig in the surrounding forest made me look up. Rusty remained alert, occasionally staring into the darkness beyond our small circle of light, his body tense. "We're fine," I told him, trying to convince myself as much as him. Just normal forest sounds. Around 10 p.m., I decided to turn in. The temperature had dropped to near freezing and the fire was dying down. I doused it carefully, stirring the embers to make sure nothing remained hot. The darkness that rushed in was absolute. My headlamp cut a weak cone through it as I guided Rusty into the tent. He turned 3 circles before settling on his blanket at the foot of my sleeping bag. I zipped the tent closed and nestled into my sleeping bag, exhausted from the day's hike. Despite my unease, sleep came quickly. I dreamed of walking through Turkey Run, but the landscape was wrong, distorted. The sandstone formations twisted into impossible shapes, and the creek ran backward, uphill. In the dream, I was searching for Rusty, who had run ahead around a bend in the trail. I kept calling his name, but my voice made no sound. When I finally rounded the bend, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the path. A woman with her back to me, wearing an old-fashioned dress, her gray hair hanging loose down her back. "Excuse me," I tried to say, but still no sound came out. She began to turn, slowly, and I was filled with a dread so powerful I thought my heart would stop. I didn't want to see her face. I knew with dream logic certainty that seeing her face would be the end of me. Just as she was about to complete her turn, Rusty's sharp bark jolted me awake. I sat up, disoriented, my heart hammering against my ribs. The tent was pitch black. My headlamp had switched off. Rusty stood at the foot of my sleeping bag, bark growling at the tent wall, his whole body vibrating with tension. "Shh," I whispered, fumbling for my headlamp. "You'll wake the whole forest." But we were alone out here. That's what made his barking so unsettling. I found the lamp and switched it on. The beam illuminated the blue nylon of the tent, revealing nothing unusual. Rusty continued to growl, now staring fixedly at the tent wall facing the creek. "What is it, boy?" I reached for him, but he wouldn't be calmed. Then I heard it, a splashing sound from the creek, Something was crossing the water, something heavy. I held my breath, listening. The splashing stopped. Then came the sound of wet footsteps on the shore, moving with deliberate slowness. Squish, pause, squish, pause. "Hello," I called out, my voice embarrassingly unsteady. "Someone there?" No response, but the footsteps stopped. I reached for my phone, irrationally hoping for a signal, but the screen showed nothing but the time. 3:17 a.m. The footsteps resumed, closer now, approaching the tent. Rusty's growls intensified. I fumbled for my pocket knife, a pitiful defense, but it was all I had. The steps circled the tent slowly, once, twice. I tracked the sound, turning my head to follow its progress. On the third circuit, they stopped directly in front of the tent flap. Something pressed against the nylon. Not a hand, but something larger, heavier, causing the whole front of the tent to bow inward. The fabric stretched as if someone was leaning their entire body weight against it. I could hear breathing now. Wet, ragged, not quite human. "Who's there?" I tried to sound authoritative, but my voice cracked. The pressure against the tent eased slightly. Then a voice spoke, a woman's voice, ancient and cracked with age, but somehow familiar. "Thomas," it whispered, "let me in." Ice slid down my spine. How did it know my name? "Go away," I said, clutching my useless knife. "I'm armed." A sound came then, a dry chuckle that turned into a wet, hacking cough. "No, you're not, Thomas. You're alone, just like you were after Claire left." The mention of my ex-wife's name hit me like a physical blow. How could this stranger know about Claire? "Who are you?" I demanded. "Someone who's been watching you," the voice replied, softer now. "Someone who knows what you need." Rusty lunged at the tent wall, barking furiously. The pressure against the tent disappeared. I heard a hiss, then the sound of retreating footsteps moving faster now, back toward the creek. Without thinking, I unzipped the tent flap and shone my headlamp into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but trees and underbrush, but when I directed it toward the creek, I saw ripples spreading across the water's surface, as if something had just crossed. "Stay," I commanded Rusty as he tried to bolt past me. I was terrified, but I needed to see if I could spot whoever, or whatever, had been at my tent. I stepped out, knife in one hand, headlamp in the other. The clearing looked undisturbed. I approached the fire ring cautiously, then directed my light toward the creek. The water flowed peacefully, the ripples now gone. But at the edge, pressed into the soft mud of the bank, was a single footprint. I moved closer, my heart pounding. It was a bare foot, but oddly shaped. Too long, the toes splayed unnaturally wide, and pressed into the mud beside it was something that made my blood freeze. My name, written with a finger in crude, childish letters. Thomas. I backed away, nearly tripping over a root. Rusty whined from the tent, sensing my fear. I had to get out of here. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. We needed to leave. I rushed back to the tent and began stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack, not bothering with proper folding. Rusty paced anxiously as I dismantled our campsite, leaving no trace would have to take a back seat to speed. "We're going, buddy," I assured him, my hands shaking as I collapsed the tent poles. "We're getting out of here." 20 minutes later, I had everything packed. My headlamp provided the only light as Rusty and I set off back up the trail toward the main park area. The night was moonless, and the forest seemed to close in around us. Every shadow might hide a watching figure. Every sound, a falling branch, an animal moving through underbrush, made me flinch. We'd been hiking for perhaps half an hour when Rusty suddenly stopped, his nose in the air. "What is it?" I whispered, dreading the answer. Then I smelled it too. Wood smoke. Someone had a fire going deep in the woods, away from any designated campsite. Under normal circumstances, I might have been concerned about a forest fire. Now, I was only worried about who might be around that fire. I tugged Rusty's leash, urging him to continue along the trail, but he resisted, pulling toward the source of the smoke. Against my better judgment, I followed him. If someone was camping out here, normal, human campers, maybe they could help me make sense of what had happened. We moved off the trail, between close-growing trees. After about 50 yards, I saw an orange glow through the branches. A small fire burned in a clearing ahead. I dimmed my headlamp and approached cautiously. The clearing was smaller than mine had been, barely large enough for the fire and a single small tent. A figure sat on a log beside the flames, face hidden beneath the hood of a parka. Rusty growled low in his throat. "Hello?" I called softly, not wanting to startle the person. The figure didn't move, didn't turn, just continued staring into the flames. "Sorry to bother you," I said, stepping closer. "I'm heading back to the trailhead. Had some trouble at my campsite." Still no response. Unease crawled up my spine. "Are you okay?" I asked, now just 10 feet from the fire. Slowly, the figure raised its head. The hood fell back, revealing the face of an elderly woman. Her skin was deeply lined, stretched taut over prominent cheekbones. But it was her eyes that made my heart stutter. Milky white, pupilless like those of a blind person. Yet she looked directly at me, as if she could see perfectly well. "Thomas Reeves," she said, in the same cracked voice I'd heard outside my tent. "Sit with me a while." Rusty's growls intensified. I took a step backward. "How do you know my name?" She smiled, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. "I know all who enter Cabot Hollow. I am Esther Cabot. This land remembers my family." "I'm just passing through," I said, taking another step back. "Don't mean to intrude." "No one just passes through," she replied, poking the fire with a stick. Sparks spiraled upward. "Everyone who comes here is looking for something. What are you looking for, Thomas?" "Nothing. Just a weekend hike." "Lies," she hissed, the word elongating into something inhuman. "You run from pain, from loneliness, from the emptiness Claire left behind." The mention of my ex-wife again sent a shock through me. "How do you know about Claire?" "I told you. I've been watching." She gestured to the log across from her. "Sit. Rest. You look tired, Thomas. So very tired of carrying it all alone." Something in her voice was hypnotic, soothing. I found myself taking a step toward her before Rusty's warning growl broke the spell. "I need to get back to the trailhead," I said firmly. "In such a hurry," she sighed. "Your kind always is. Running, running, never standing still long enough to hear what the hollow has to say." "And what does it say?" Her milky eyes seemed to glow in the firelight. "That you belong to it now, that you'll never really leave." As she spoke, I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. Shapes detached themselves from the darkness between trees, human-like figures standing unnaturally still. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel their eyes on me. "Who are they?" I whispered. "Others who came to the hollow," Esther said simply. "Looking for escape, for answers. They found them." One of the figures stepped forward into the dim light cast by the fire. It was a man, or had been once. His skin had a waxy gray pallor, and his eyes were the same milky white as Esther's. He wore tattered hiking clothes caked with mud. When he opened his mouth, I saw the same filed teeth. "Join us, Thomas," Esther urged, her voice suddenly eager. "Your pain can end tonight. No more emptiness, no more loneliness. Become part of something larger." The figures began to move closer, emerging from the trees all around the clearing. There were at least a dozen of them. Men, women, all with the same dead eyes and sharp teeth. Their movements were wrong somehow, jerky and fluid by turns, as if they weren't fully in control of their bodies. Rusty barked frantically, backing up against my legs. I gripped his leash tighter, my other hand fumbling for my knife again. "I have people expecting me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My sister knows where I am. She'll call the rangers if I don't check in tomorrow." Esther's smile widened impossibly, stretching her face in a way human muscles shouldn't allow. "Many who came before you said the same. Their families searched. The rangers searched. They found nothing." I glanced behind me, looking for a path of escape, but the pale figures had encircled us completely. They moved with eerie coordination, like parts of a single organism. "What do you want from me?" I asked, playing for time, desperately trying to think of a way out. "To feed the hollow," Esther said simply. "It hungers. Always hungers." As she spoke, the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. I looked down and saw, to my horror, that the soil was moving, pulsing slightly, like the surface of something breathing. "The land itself is alive here," Esther continued, standing now. She was taller than she had appeared sitting down, her limbs too long, joints bending at odd angles. "My family woke it centuries ago with blood and ritual. It protected us, fed us, and in return, we feed it." The circle of pale figures tightened. One reached out a hand toward me, the fingers too long, knuckles swollen and knotted like tree roots. In that moment, my paralysis broke. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it in a wide arc, forcing the nearest figures back. Then I ran, pulling Rusty along with me, crashing through the underbrush in what I hoped was the direction of the trail. Behind us came sounds of pursuit, not running footsteps, but a strange scuttling noise, like multiple limbs moving across forest floor. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to rise up deliberately to trip me. Twice I fell, scrambling back to my feet immediately, terror giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. I had no idea if we were heading in the right direction. Every tree, every shadow looked the same in the weak beam of my headlamp. But I kept running, Rusty now leading the way, his animal instincts more reliable than my panicked human ones. The scuttling sounds grew closer. I dared a glance back and saw them moving through the trees. Not running, but flowing, their bodies distorting in impossible ways to slip between trunks and under branches. Esther was at the front, her body now hunched over, using her arms as well as her legs to propel herself forward, spider-like. "You cannot leave the hollow, Thomas," her voice called, somehow right beside my ear despite her being yards behind me. "No one leaves!" Rusty suddenly veered left, yanking me off balance. I stumbled but kept my feet, following his lead. Through the trees ahead, I caught a glimpse of lighter space, the trail. We burst out of the underbrush onto the marked path. Without hesitation, I turned uphill, toward where I thought the main park area would be. Behind us, the scuttling sounds stopped abruptly. I glanced back to see the pale figures lined up at the edge of the vegetation, watching us with their dead eyes. They made no move to follow us onto the trail. Esther stood at their center, her body now grotesquely elongated, nearly 7 feet tall. She raised one twisted hand in what might have been farewell. "The hollow has tasted you now, Thomas Reeves," she called. "It knows your scent, your fear, your loneliness. It will wait." I didn't stop to respond or look back again. Rusty and I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. The trail climbed steadily, taking us further from Cabot Hollow with every step. Only when we reached a trail junction with a park map did I finally slow to catch my breath. According to the map, we were still 3 miles from the main parking area. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, the first gray light filtering through the trees. In that dim illumination, the forest looked ordinary again, just trees and undergrowth, nothing sinister lurking between them. But I knew better now. I knew what waited in Cabot Hollow after dark. We made it back to the parking lot as the sun cleared the horizon. My car sat where I'd left it, looking impossibly normal and safe. As Rusty and I approached, I saw a park ranger truck pull in beside it. Earl, the ranger from yesterday, stepped out, surprise evident on his weathered face. "You're back early," he observed, taking in my disheveled appearance, the scratches on my face from branches. the mud caking my clothes. "Everything okay?" I hesitated. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound insane? I settled for, "Had some trouble at the campsite, decided to hike out early." Earl's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where'd you end up camping?" "Cabot Hollow," I said, "near Sugar Creek." Something flickered in his expression. Not surprise, I realized, but confirmation. "Ran into anyone out there?" he asked carefully. My heart rate, which had just begun to normalize, spiked again. "What do you mean?" Earl sighed, looking suddenly older. "Sometimes hikers report seeing an old woman out near Cabot Hollow, usually at night, usually when they're alone." "Who is she?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "According to local legend, Esther Cabot. Her family settled that hollow back in the 1800s. Strange folk, kept to themselves, rumors of cult activity, people going missing. The whole family disappeared in 1897, but—" He trailed off, looking embarrassed. "Well, some folks say Esther never left, that she made some kind of deal with something in those woods." "You believe that?" I challenged. Earl met my eyes. "I believe there's places in these parks that don't feel right after dark. Cabot Hollow's one of them. We don't send people to camp there anymore. Your permit should have been for Campsite B, over by the fire tower." I pulled out my crumpled permit. Sure enough, it read, "Site B, Fire Tower Ridge." "But you said—" I began. Earl shook his head. "I warned you about Cabot Hollow. Never said to camp there." He studied my face. "You saw her, didn't you?" I considered denying it, but what was the point? "Yes, her and others." He nodded slowly. "You got out. That's the important thing. Some don't. Shouldn't you close that area? Put up warnings?" "Park management doesn't hold with ghost stories," Earl said with a shrug. "And most times nothing happens. Just cold nights and strange sounds." "Those weren't just strange sounds," I insisted. "Those weren't just ghost stories." Earl's gaze softened. "I believe you, son. But what exactly would you have me report? That the hollow is haunted by a 150-year-old woman who files her teeth to points? That the ground breathes? They'd have me retired on psychological grounds by sunset." He was right. Of course. Even now, standing in the normal morning light, part of me wondered if I'd imagined it all. Some combination of isolation, darkness, and lingering emotional trauma from my divorce creating a waking nightmare. But then I remembered the writing in the mud. My name, scratched out by an inhuman hand. The milky eyes watching me from the tree line. Esther's impossible smile. "Get some rest," Earl advised, patting my shoulder. "Put it behind you. Most folks who encounter the hollow once is enough. She doesn't usually follow them out." Usually. The word hung in the air between us. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. Rusty and I got into the car, and I started the engine, cranking the heater to full blast to dispel the lingering chill in my bones. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Earl stood watching us leave, a concerned expression on his face. Beyond him, at the edge of the tree line, I thought I saw movement. A tall, thin shape slipping between trunks. But when I blinked, it was gone. I drove straight back to Indianapolis without stopping, Rusty sleeping exhausted in the back seat. When I finally reached my apartment, I took the longest, hottest shower of my life, trying to wash away the feeling of the hollow's eyes on me. That was 3 days ago. I've called in sick to work, haven't left my apartment. Food delivery and silence are my companions, along with Rusty, who hasn't left my side. I keep the lights on, even during the day, because sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear Esther's voice, crackling like dry leaves. "The hollow has tasted you, Thomas Reeves. It knows your scent. It will wait." And sometimes in the dark, I could swear the floor beneath my bed pulses slightly, like something breathing. Last night I woke at precisely 3:17 a.m. to find Rusty standing at my bedroom door, hackles raised, growling at something in the living room. I didn't investigate, couldn't make myself get out of bed. This morning, I found mud tracked across my kitchen floor, mud that matches the distinctive reddish clay of Turkey Run, and on my refrigerator, written in that same mud, was my name. Thomas. I'm leaving Indianapolis today, moving in with my sister in Arizona, somewhere dry, open, without forests or hollows. But deep down, I fear it won't matter how far I run, because Esther was right. A part of me never left Cabot Hollow, and a part of it, whatever lives in that hungry ground, came back with me. It's waiting, and sooner or later, I know it will find me. My name is Daniel Carson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2024. The morning fog clung to Yellowwood State Forest like a death shroud. I stood at the trailhead, backpack straps digging into my shoulders, watching as my breath crystallized in the autumn air. My dog, Max, a German shepherd with more intelligence in his eyes than most humans I'd met, pawed nervously at the ground beside me. "It's just a weekend trip, buddy," I assured him, scratching behind his ears. But the tremble in my voice betrayed my own unease. Something about this forest felt wrong. I'd chosen Yellowwood specifically because of its remoteness. After my divorce was finalized last month, after Jessica took everything, including our home, I needed space, distance. The forest's 15,000 acres of rugged terrain sprawling across Brown County promised exactly that. I'd mapped out a 3-day route that would take me deep into the backcountry, away from the popular campsites and marked trails, following the serpentine path of Yellowwood Lake before cutting eastward toward the Tecumseh Trail. Max whined, his ears flattening against his skull. "What is it, boy?" I knelt beside him, following his gaze into the dense tree line. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine. This was ridiculous. I was a former Eagle Scout with extensive wilderness experience. A software engineer by trade, yes, but I'd spent my childhood summers camping with my father in these very woods. I knew how to survive out here. What I didn't know was that survival would soon be the only thing that mattered. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail meandered through stands of oak, maple, and hickory trees blazing with autumn colors. Yet, despite the beauty, I couldn't shake the growing sense of isolation that pressed down on me. My phone showed no signal bars, expected, but the GPS still functioned. According to the topo map I'd downloaded, we were approaching a ravine that would lead us to our first campsite. "Come on, Max," I called, noticing he'd fallen behind. He stood rigid, hackles raised, staring into a dense thicket of undergrowth. "Max!" A low growl rumbled from his throat. I'd never heard him make that sound before, not even when the mailman came to our door. "There's nothing there, buddy." I pulled out my flashlight despite the afternoon sun still filtering through the canopy, and aimed it at the patch of forest that had captured his attention. The beam illuminated nothing but fallen leaves and twisted roots. Max reluctantly rejoined me, but his body remained tense, his steps measured as if he were stalking something, or being stalked. We reached the ravine by mid-afternoon. A ribbon of black water cut through the landscape, carving a path between steep limestone walls. The site I'd marked for our first night perched on a small bluff overlooking this natural feature. Perfect visibility, defensible terrain. The thought came unbidden, as if I were preparing for battle rather than leisure. While setting up my tent, I felt the first droplets of rain, another expected obstacle. The forecast had predicted a storm system moving through. I worked quickly, securing the rainfly and gathering firewood before the downpour began in earnest. As darkness fell, we huddled beneath the shelter of a large tarp I'd strung between trees. The fire sputtered beneath it, casting flickering shadows across our small camp. Max lay beside me, his head on his paws, eyes fixed on the edge of the light's reach. The rain intensified, drumming against the tarp in a chaotic rhythm. Thunder rolled across the sky, followed by flashes of lightning that momentarily illuminated the forest in stark relief. During one such flash, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A figure, standing just beyond the camp's perimeter, tall, impossibly thin, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. A trick of the light. Had to be. I pulled Max closer, grateful for his warmth against the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Just the rain playing tricks on us, I whispered, uncertain if I was trying to convince him or myself. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the storm and by Max's occasional growls. Each time I woke, I found him staring at the same spot at the edge of our camp, his body coiled with tension. Around 3 a.m., I jolted awake to the sound of cracking branches. Max was already on his feet, teeth bared, emitting that same unnatural growl. I fumbled for my flashlight, heart hammering against my ribs. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rain-slicked trees and underbrush bent by the wind. Yet the cracking continued, growing louder, more deliberate, like footsteps, circling our camp. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly thin. "I have a dog." The sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. Even the rain seemed to lessen, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice replied. Not with words, but with a sound that approximated human laughter. A high, keening noise that raised every hair on my body. I did not sleep again that night. Dawn broke, gray and cheerless. The storm had passed, leaving behind a forest draped in mist and an unshakable sense of dread. I should have packed up then, should have turned back. But pride is a dangerous thing in the wilderness, and I had something to prove, if only to myself. "We're fine," I told Max as I folded the tarp, noting how my hands trembled. "Just some local wildlife, maybe a coyote." But coyotes don't laugh. I checked my GPS to confirm our route to Yellowwood Lake. The screen flickered, then displayed a map that looked wrong. The familiar contours of the forest were distorted, the trail markers misplaced. I switched to my physical map and compass, relieved to find they at least seemed functional. We would follow Scarso Fat Creek southwest until it joined the lake. From there, we'd pick up the peninsula trail that would lead to our second campsite. The day's hike took us deeper into the forest's embrace. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked much of the daylight. The ground became treacherous with hidden roots and sudden drop-offs. Twice I nearly twisted an ankle on what should have been level ground. Max stayed close, occasionally stopping to sniff the air, his posture alert. I began to rely on his senses more than my own, pausing whenever he did, changing direction when he seemed reluctant to proceed. By midday, we reached a clearing I didn't recognize from any of my maps. At its center stood a single oak tree, massive and ancient, its trunk gnarled like arthritic fingers. Hundreds of small objects dangled from its lower branches, swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. Curiosity overcame caution. I approached, squinting to make out what hung from the tree. My stomach lurched when I realized what I was seeing. Dolls. Dozens of them. Some fashioned from twigs and twine, others from cloth and what looked disturbingly like human hair. Each had crude facial features, button eyes, stitched mouths pulled into grimaces. They hung by their necks from lengths of red thread. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, backing away. Max barked sharply, tugging at my pant leg as if trying to pull me from the clearing. A soft crack sounded behind me. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. A woman stood at the clearing's edge, elderly, with skin like weathered leather and hair the color of iron filings. She wore a faded floral dress that hung from her thin frame, and rubber boots caked with mud. In her gnarled hands, she clutched something that looked like another half-finished doll. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice like stones grinding together. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I'm just hiking through. I didn't realize this was private property. Not my property. Her eyes, milky with cataracts, seemed to look through me rather than at me. Theirs. Whose? I asked, though some part of me desperately didn't want to know. She didn't answer my question. Instead, she tilted her head, studying Max with something like recognition. Dog sees 'em. Dogs always do. She nodded toward the dolls. These keep 'em away, most times. Keeps who away? The hollow ones. She said it matter-of-factly, as if naming a local species of wildlife. They've been here since before the settlers, before the tribes even. She took a step closer, and I caught a whiff of something rancid. They hungry this time of year. Getting ready for winter. Max growled low in his throat. I placed a hand on his collar, as much for my own comfort as to restrain him. I should get going, I said, edging toward the path from which we'd come. Nice meeting you, ma'am. Won't make it out before dark, she called after me as I retreated. Not now you've been marked. I didn't ask what she meant. Didn't want to know. I just pulled Max along with me, back into the relative safety of the trees, away from the doll tree and its caretaker. Only when we were well clear of the clearing did I notice. My GPS was dead. Not low battery. Dead. The screen cracked down the middle, though I couldn't recall dropping it. And my compass was spinning wildly, the needle rotating in complete circles as if seeking something it couldn't find. I swallowed hard, trying to orient myself based on the sun's position. East. We needed to go east to reach the lake. But which way was east when the sky was a uniform gray and every direction looked the same? Max seemed to sense my indecision. He tugged at his leash, pulling me to the right. I had no better plan, so I followed. As we walked, the forest grew increasingly unfamiliar. The trees seemed wrong somehow, their trunks too smooth, branches reaching too deliberately, like fingers grasping at passing hikers. I found myself checking repeatedly for trail markers, even though I knew we had left the established paths far behind, and always that feeling of being watched, of something tracking our movements. Mid-afternoon brought us to the banks of what I initially took to be Yellowwood Lake, but the water was wrong. Darker, almost black, with no visible current. The far shore disappeared into mist, giving no sense of the lake's true size. Max refused to drink from it, even though our water supplies were running low. When I dipped my hand in to test the temperature, the liquid felt oddly viscous, clinging to my skin. I wiped it hastily on my pants, suddenly nauseated. We followed the shoreline, hoping to find a crossing or at least a recognizable landmark. After what felt like hours, but according to my watch was only 40 minutes, we came upon the remains of a campsite. My campsite. The same bluff overlooking the same ravine where we'd spent the previous night. My tent still stood, though now it was collapsed on one side, as if something heavy had pushed against it. The fire pit was cold, covered with a layer of wet leaves that couldn't have accumulated in less than a day. This isn't possible, I muttered, turning in a complete circle. We've been walking away from this spot all day. Max whined, pressing against my leg. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, the forest darkening around us. With no functional GPS or compass, and no clear idea of which direction to take, I made the decision to spend another night at the same site. At least it was familiar terrain. I rebuilt the fire, larger than necessary, telling myself it was to dry out the damp ground, and not because I was afraid of what might lurk in the darkness. Max wouldn't leave my side, not even to chase the squirrels that chattered nervously from the nearby trees. As I repitched the damaged tent, I discovered something that turned my blood to ice. The collapsed side wasn't due to wind or rain. The fabric had been slashed. 3 parallel cuts, too precise to be accidental, too evenly spaced to be anything but deliberate. Someone, or something, had been inside my tent. I checked my backpack, still hanging from the branch where I'd left it. The main compartment was open. though I distinctly remembered zipping it closed. My food supplies were untouched, but my spare clothes had been disturbed, arranged in a peculiar pattern on top of my other gear. A circle, with my socks forming rays emanating outward like a child's drawing of the sun. The old woman's words echoed in my mind. "Not now, you've been marked." I repacked my bag with trembling hands and considered my options. Night hiking was dangerous under normal circumstances, practically suicidal in unfamiliar terrain with malfunctioning navigation equipment, but staying put felt equally perilous. In the end, exhaustion made the decision for me. I couldn't keep moving without rest, and at least here, I had the fire for protection and visibility. I decided against sleeping in the damaged tent, instead creating a makeshift shelter from the tarp, positioned so that my back was against a large boulder with clear sight lines in all other directions. As darkness fell completely, the forest came alive with sound. Not the normal nocturnal chorus of insects and owls, but something else. A pulsing, rhythmic sound, like dozens of voices whispering just below the threshold of comprehension. Max heard it too. He sat rigid beside me, ears pricked forward, occasionally emitting a low whine that made the back of my neck prickle. I fed more wood into the fire, watching as the flames cast our distorted shadows against the rock face behind us. Except, I froze, counting silently. One shadow was mine. One was Max's. The third, elongated and misshapen, belonged to neither of us. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned to look over my shoulder. Nothing was there. Yet when I faced forward again, the third shadow remained, its proportions all wrong. Limbs too long, head too small, fingers like needles. I blinked hard, telling myself it was just a trick of the firelight. When I opened my eyes, the shadow was gone. In its place, at the very edge of the fire's reach, stood a figure. The same impossibly thin silhouette I'd glimpsed during the storm. But now, with no rain to obscure my vision, I could see it clearly. It was human-shaped, but wrong in fundamental ways. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible directions. Its skin was a patchwork of textures. Here, bark-like, there smooth as river stones, elsewhere matted like fur. Its face was the worst part, features that shifted and rearranged themselves as if unable to decide on a final form. Max's growl became a frantic barking. The figure cocked its head, studying us with eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. I reached for my hunting knife with numb fingers. "Stay back," I warned, my voice a pathetic croak. The creature didn't move, but somewhere behind it, another figure emerged from the darkness. Then another, and another. Soon, a dozen stood in a loose semicircle around our camp, just beyond the firelight. The hollow ones. They had to be. Max's barking reached a fevered pitch. I clutched his collar, terrified he might charge them. "Easy, boy," I whispered. "Easy." For what felt like hours, we remained in this standoff, me clutching my knife, Max alternating between growls and whimpers, the creatures watching with unblinking eyes. They never approached the fire, but neither did they retreat. Then, as if responding to some signal I couldn't perceive, they began to move. Not toward us, but around the perimeter of our camp, circling slowly. As they moved, they produced that same sound I'd heard earlier. Not quite speech, but rhythmic and deliberate, like a chant in some ancient, forgotten language. My eyes strained to follow their movement, but it was impossible to keep track of all of them at once. They seemed to flicker in and out of visibility, as if not fully present in our reality. The fire began to sputter and dim, though I had added fresh fuel only minutes before. The flames turned an unnatural blue-green, casting sickly light that somehow made the darkness beyond seem even more impenetrable. Max suddenly went silent, his body rigid with tension. Following his gaze, I saw one of the creatures had broken from the circle. It stood directly across the fire from us, its features resolving into something almost familiar. Jessica. The name escaped my lips before I could stop it. The thing wearing my ex-wife's face smiled, but the expression was wrong. Too wide, teeth too numerous and sharp. When it spoke, the voice was hers, but layered with something else, something ancient and hungry. "Daniel," it said, my name sounding like a death sentence in its mouth. "We've been waiting for you." "You're not real," I hissed, pressing back against the boulder. "None of this is real." The creature's smile widened impossibly. "We're the only real thing in these woods, Daniel. We've always been here, watching, waiting." It gestured at the forest around us. "This land remembers what was done here. The blood that was spilled, the sacrifices made. I don't know what you're talking about." My knife felt pathetically inadequate against the horror before me. "Your ancestors did," Not Jessica replied. "The settlers who drove out the tribes, who killed our worshippers and thought they killed us too." Its face shifted, features melting and reforming into another familiar visage, my father's. "But we don't die, Daniel. We just get hungry. My father had brought me to these woods as a child, had taught me to hunt, to track, to survive. Had he known what lurked here? Had he been protecting me all those years ago, or preparing me?" "What do you want?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. The creature's face shifted again, this time taking on aspects of my own features like a funhouse mirror reflection. "Company," it said simply. "It gets lonely in the hollow places of the world." As it spoke, I became aware of a pressure in my head, a buzzing that grew louder with each passing second. Images flashed behind my eyes, visions of myself walking deeper into the forest, of joining the circle of watchers, of my skin changing, transforming. "No!" I shouted, the sound breaking whatever spell had begun to take hold. I lunged forward, thrusting my burning flashlight into the fire and then at the creature wearing my face. It recoiled with a screech that was echoed by the others around the camp. Max seized the moment, charging at the nearest entity with snapping jaws. His teeth seemed to connect with something solid despite the creature's ethereal appearance, eliciting an otherworldly howl of pain. "Run, Max!" I yelled, grabbing my backpack and the still-burning branch. The creatures were momentarily disoriented, their circle broken, creating a gap in their formation. We bolted through the opening, plunging into the darkness beyond. I had no plan beyond escape, no direction in mind. Pure animal terror drove me forward, crashing through underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks. Behind us, the chittering voices rose in what could only be described as rage. The forest itself seemed to come alive, branches reaching down to tear at my clothes and hair, roots rising to trip my feet. Max stayed close, guiding me through the treacherous terrain with his superior night vision. I had no idea how long we ran or in what direction. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to buckle, but stopping meant death. Or worse. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the normal nocturnal forest sounds. Owls hooting, insects chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. We emerged from a dense thicket into a clearing bathed in moonlight. In its center stood a small dilapidated cabin. Under normal circumstances, I would have been wary of such a structure deep in the woods, but now it represented potential sanctuary. I approached cautiously, Max growling softly beside me. The cabin appeared long abandoned, its windows dark, door hanging ajar on rusted hinges. Using my improvised torch, I checked the interior. A single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture covered in dust, and walls decorated with faded hunting trophies and dolls. Similar to those hanging from the tree, but more elaborate. Dozens of them, arranged on shelves and hanging from the ceiling beams. In the firelight, their button eyes seemed to follow our movements. "The old woman," I whispered, suddenly understanding. This must be her cabin. The dolls were wardings, protections against the hollow ones. Despite every horror movie instinct screaming against it, I decided we would shelter here until dawn. I closed and barricaded the door, then used the last of my torch to light a fire in the hearth. As warmth slowly filled the small space, I examined our surroundings more carefully. A table held what looked like the old woman's workstation: scissors, needles, spools of red thread, and materials for doll making. Beside these lay an open journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting and crude drawings. I picked it up, morbidly curious. The journal belonged to someone named Martha Holloway, who described herself as the last keeper of Yellowwood Forest. The entries dated back decades, detailing encounters with what she called the folk, and her efforts to contain them using the old ways. According to Martha, the entities had existed in these woods since prehistoric times, worshipped by indigenous peoples and later feared by European settlers. They weren't ghosts or demons in the traditional sense, but something older, fragments of ancient consciousness tied to the land itself, feeding on fear and memory. The dolls were traps of a sort, designed to house fragments of the entity's essence, limiting their ability to fully manifest. Martha wrote of a binding ritual performed annually at the autumn equinox, a ritual that had been disrupted 3 years ago when outsiders destroyed her work. The most recent entry was dated just 1 week earlier. They grow stronger as my strength fades. The binding weakens. Soon I will join my ancestors, and there will be no one left who knows the old ways. May God have mercy on those who wander these woods when the folk are free. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the autumn night. I was reading the words of a woman who believed she was the only thing standing between humanity and ancient horrors. A woman I had met, who had tried to warn me. Max's sudden growl pulled me from these thoughts. He stood by the single window, hackles raised, staring into the darkness beyond. I joined him, peering cautiously through the grimy glass. At first, I saw nothing but moonlit forest. Then, movement, shadows detaching from deeper shadows, forming a loose circle around the cabin. The hollow ones had found us, but they kept their distance, pacing at the edge of the clearing as if unable, or unwilling, to approach the cabin itself. The dolls, I realized. Martha's protections were still functioning, at least partially. A flicker of hope sparked in my chest. If we could hold out until dawn, perhaps the creatures would retreat to whatever dark dimension they inhabited during daylight hours. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Just a few more hours. I reinforced our barricades, then settled beside Max near the fire, the journal clutched in my hands. Sleep was impossible, but I could at least rest and plan our next move. The journal contained a crude map of the forest, marking safe paths and thin places where the barrier between worlds was weakest. If accurate, it showed we were actually quite close to the main park road, less than 2 miles east of our position. As I studied the map, a peculiar sound reached my ears, a soft tapping at the window. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Max growled, moving closer to me. I raised my eyes slowly to the window. A face pressed against the glass. Not one of the hollow ones, but human. A woman, perhaps 30, with wild eyes and matted hair. When she saw me looking, she gestured frantically, mouthing words I couldn't understand. I approached cautiously, knife in hand. "Who are you?" I called. "Let me in," she pleaded, voice muffled by the glass. "Please, they're coming." I hesitated. This could be a trick, another form the hollow ones had assumed to lure me out. But what if she was real? Another hiker, lost and terrified as I was. "Step back from the window," I instructed. "Let me see that you're alone." She complied, moving away until she stood fully visible in the moonlight. She wore torn hiking clothes, a backpack hanging from one shoulder, no obvious weapons or signs of inhumanity. "What's your name?" I asked, still wary. "Rebecca," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Rebecca Winters. I've been lost for 2 days. Please, I saw your light. They've been hunting me." Against my better judgment and Max's warning growl, I moved the barricade and opened the door just enough for her to slip inside. I closed and secured it immediately after. In the firelight, I could see her more clearly. She was indeed human, or appeared so. Dirty, exhausted, with scratches on her face and arms that looked consistent with running through dense forest at night. Her eyes darted around the cabin, widening at the sight of the dolls. "What is this place?" she whispered. "Some kind of protective shelter," I explained, giving her a brief account of Martha and her journal. "The things out there seem unable to enter." Rebecca nodded, sinking to the floor near the fire. "I saw them yesterday. Thought I was hallucinating at first. My friend Tyler and I were camping at Yellowwood Lake when..." Her voice broke. "They took him, right out of the tent while I was gathering firewood. When I came back, there was just blood. So much blood." Her story had the ring of truth, or at least she believed it was true. Max still watched her warily, but his growling had subsided to occasional whines. "We should be safe here until morning," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. "Then we can try to reach the main road. It's apparently not far." Rebecca nodded, extending her hands toward the fire. "Thank you for letting me in. I thought I was going to die out there." We lapsed into uneasy silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The creatures continued their vigil outside, occasionally testing the boundaries with probing shadows that slid under the door or between window boards, only to recoil from proximity to the dolls. Around 4:30 a.m., Rebecca spoke again. "Your dog doesn't like me." It was true. Max had maintained his distance from her, watching with unblinking intensity. I had attributed it to his general wariness around strangers, especially in our current circumstances. But now I noticed something else. He wasn't just watching her. He was positioning himself between her and me as if protecting me. "He's been on edge since we entered these woods," I said carefully, suddenly aware of a subtle change in the cabin's atmosphere. The fire seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper. Animals sense things we can't. Rebecca smiled, a fraction too wide. "Smart dog." She tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that raised goosebumps on my arms. "You don't belong here, Daniel." I never told her my name. Max erupted into barking, lunging toward Rebecca. In one fluid, impossible movement, she was on her feet, body contorting in ways human anatomy shouldn't allow. "The old woman's tricks grow weaker," not Rebecca said, her voice now layered with others, like multiple people speaking in unison. "Soon they will fail entirely." I scrambled backward, knife extended. "Stay back." Her form was changing, skin rippling like water, limbs elongating. "We are patient," the thing said. "We have existed in these hollow places since before your kind learned to speak. We can wait a little longer." Max charged, teeth bared, but the creature swatted him aside with terrible strength. He hit the wall with a yelp that tore at my heart, then crumpled to the floor, motionless. "Max!" I cried, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening the creature needed. It lunged forward, impossibly fast, knocking the knife from my hand. Cold, strong fingers wrapped around my throat, lifting me until my feet dangled above the floor. Its face continued to shift, cycling through features I recognized: Rebecca, Jessica, my father, myself, before settling on something that was none of these and all of them. A horrific composite of human features arranged in inhuman ways. "Your fear tastes sweeter than most," it hissed, breath like rotten leaves and stagnant water. "Perhaps we will keep you, make you one of us. You could join the hunt, Daniel. Never be alone again." Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as its grip tightened. In desperation, I reached out, hand closing around the nearest object, one of Martha's unfinished dolls. The moment my fingers touched it, the creature shrieked, releasing me. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, the doll still clutched in my hand. The entity backed away, its form flickering like bad reception on an old TV. Understanding dawned through my oxygen-deprived haze. The dolls weren't just wardings, they were weapons. I lunged for Martha's workstation, grabbing a handful of completed dolls and a spool of red thread. The creature recovered quickly, advancing again with malicious intent, but it hesitated when I held the dolls before me like a crucifix. "Back," I commanded, unsure if I was doing this right but desperate enough to try anything. "I bind you by the old ways." Whether it was the dolls themselves or the conviction in my voice, the creature paused. Its form solidified somewhat, becoming more distinctly human, or rather mimicking humanity more effectively. It was Rebecca again, but with eyes that glowed faintly in the dimming firelight. "You don't know the words," it said, though with less certainty than before. "You don't know the binding." It was right. I had no idea what ritual Martha performed, what words she spoke, but I had something the entity didn't expect: desperation born of love. Max stirred weakly in the corner, alive but injured. I would not let these things take him, would not become one of them, would not join their eternal, hungry hunt. "I don't need her words," I said with more confidence than I felt. "I have my own." With trembling fingers, I wound the red thread around the doll in my hand, focusing all my fear, all my determination, all my will into a single purpose: binding this horror back to whatever dark dimension it came from. "By my blood and breath," I improvised, "by my name and my will, I bind you. By the love I bear for those you would harm, I command you. Return to your hollow places and trouble this world no more." The creature laughed, but the sound was uncertain, fracturing at the edges. "Pretty words," it said, taking a step forward, "but empty. The binding requires sacrifice. The old woman knew this." Sacrifice? Of course. Nothing worth having comes without cost. Martha had given her life to this forest, to keeping its dangers contained. What was I willing to give? The answer came immediately. Anything to save Max. Anything to prevent these horrors from reaching the outside world. I raised the knife I had recovered, placing its edge against my palm. "Then a sacrifice you shall have." Before I could second-guess myself, I drew the blade across my skin. Blood welled immediately, dripping onto the doll and the red thread wrapped around it. The cabin filled with a sound like distant thunder. The creature shrieked, its form destabilizing completely. Around us, the other dolls in the cabin began to tremble, their button eyes glowing with an inner light. Outside, the circling entities set up a terrible wailing that shook the very foundations of the cabin. I pressed forward, wound throbbing, holding the blood-stained doll toward the thing that had pretended to be Rebecca. "I bind you with my blood," I said, words coming from some place of instinct and desperation. "I name you and claim power over you. Return to your hollow place." The creature writhed, its body elongating and contracting in nauseating waves. The cabin shook as if in the grip of an earthquake. Dolls flew from their shelves, swirling around us in a macabre tornado. And still I advanced, the bloody doll extended before me. A tremendous crack split the air. The cabin's roof tore away, revealing a sky turning from black to deep purple, the first hint of approaching dawn. The entities outside surged forward, no longer held back by Martha's failing protections. But as they reached the threshold, the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern horizon, spearing through the trees to touch the clearing. Where the light fell, the creatures smoked and shriveled like slugs doused in salt. Inhuman screams filled the air as they retreated, melting back into the forest shadows. Only the one inside remained, trapped between my advance and the growing light behind me. It made one final, desperate lunge. I thrust the doll forward, directly into its chest. For an instant, I felt resistance, as if the doll had impacted solid flesh. Then it sank inward, disappearing into the creature's form. The entity froze, suspended in mid-motion. A tremor ran through it, followed by another. stronger one. Cracks appeared across its skin, light spilling from within. It opened its mouth, not to speak but to scream, a sound so primal and agonized that I clapped my hands over my ears. Then, like a balloon filled with light rather than air, the creature exploded. There was no blood, no viscera, just fragments of shadow and mist that dissipated in the growing dawn light. Where it had stood, Martha's doll lay on the cabin floor, now blackened as if charred in intense heat. I stood, trembling, adrenaline still coursing through my system, unable to process what had just happened. The rising sun cast long fingers of light through the ruined cabin roof, illuminating dust motes and the scattered remains of Martha's protective dolls. Max's whimper broke through my daze. I rushed to his side, heart in my throat. He was alive, but injured, breathing labored, a gash along his side where the creature had struck him. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, gently examining his wounds. Nothing appeared life-threatening, but he needed veterinary attention. We both needed to get out of these woods. Now. Using strips torn from my shirt, I bandaged Max's wound as best I could. He licked my hand weakly, his trust in me unwavering despite the horror we'd endured. I gathered what remained of our supplies, including Martha's journal, which felt too important to leave behind, and helped Max to his feet. He could walk, though with obvious pain. I shouldered my pack, keeping the hunting knife readily accessible, and oriented myself using the crude map in Martha's journal and the rising sun. East. 2 miles to the main park road. A 30-minute hike under normal circumstances, perhaps an hour given our condition. "We're going home, buddy," I promised Max, scratching behind his ears. The sunlight seemed to have banished the worst of the supernatural horrors, but I wasn't taking any chances. We needed to move quickly before sunset potentially brought their return. The forest looked different in daylight, just trees and underbrush, streams and rocks. No reaching branches, no hostile terrain. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, insects buzzed. Normal, natural. It was almost possible to believe that the events of the past 2 nights had been mere hallucinations, products of isolation and fear. Almost, but for the wound on my palm, the injured dog at my side, and the blackened doll now tucked into my pack. We made slow but steady progress, with me constantly checking the journal's map against landmarks. The terrain began to slope upward, becoming rockier, a good sign according to Martha's notes. The main ridge trail should lie just beyond the next rise. As we crested the hill, I spotted something that made my heart leap. Asphalt. The main park road cutting a winding path through the forest, and better yet, a park ranger vehicle parked at a turnout just 100 yards away. "Max, look," I pointed, relief washing over me. "We made it." His tail wagged feebly, but his eyes showed he understood. Civilization. Safety. I helped him down the slope, my mind already composing the story I would tell the ranger. Not the truth, obviously. Who would believe that? Some sanitized version involving getting lost, injuring ourselves in a fall. Anything to get us out of Yellowwood Forest. The ranger, a stocky middle-aged man named Thornton, according to his nameplate, was initially skeptical of my vague explanation, but became more concerned when he saw our injuries. He radioed for medical assistance and helped load Max into his vehicle. "You're lucky I was checking this section today," he commented as we drove toward the park entrance. "Not many folks come out this way, especially this time of year. These woods can be dangerous if you don't know them." I almost laughed at the understatement. "Have you worked here long?" I asked instead, wondering how much he might know about the forest's darker aspects. "Going on 20 years," he replied, navigating the winding road with practiced ease. "Seen a lot of strange things in my time." I studied his weathered face, wondering if I dared probe further. "Like what?" He glanced at me, expression unreadable. "Folks getting lost when they shouldn't. Equipment failing for no reason. Animals behaving oddly." A pause. "And sometimes people disappearing." My blood ran cold. "Disappearing?" Thornton nodded grimly. Not often, maybe once every few years. Hikers who never make it back to their cars, campers who leave their tents and vanish into the night. We find their gear sometimes, but never them. What? I swallowed hard. What do you think happens to them? The ranger was silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally he spoke, voice pitched low as if sharing a secret. There's something wrong with certain parts of this forest. Always has been. The old-timers used to talk about hollow places, spots where the veil between worlds is thin. The hollow ones. Martha's journal had used similar terminology. Most rangers won't go near those areas after dark, Thornton continued. We mark them as ecological study zones, restricted access. It's safer that way. But you don't actually believe, I began. I believe what I've seen, he cut me off. And I've seen enough to know there are things in these woods that don't belong in our world. His gaze flicked to me in the rearview mirror. Just like I know you didn't get those injuries from a simple fall, and your dog wasn't hurt by any normal animal. I met his eyes, seeing knowledge there, and fear. He knew. Maybe not the specifics, but he understood the fundamental truth about Yellowwood Forest. He was another guardian, like Martha, keeping people away from the hollow places. There was a woman, I said carefully, elderly, living alone in a cabin. She made dolls. Thornton's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Martha Holloway, found her 3 days ago, dead in her bed. Natural causes according to the coroner, but he trailed off, shaking his head. But what? The timing felt wrong, like something was waiting for her to die. He glanced at me again. If you met her, that wasn't Martha. She's been dead for days. A chill ran through me. If not Martha, then who, or what, had I encountered in that clearing? Another manifestation of the Hollow Ones? Or something else entirely? We reached the park entrance where an ambulance was already waiting. Paramedics took charge of Max and me, cleaning and properly dressing our wounds. Max would need surgery for his damaged ribs, but the prognosis was good. My hand required stitches, and both of us were dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise intact. As they prepared to transport us to the hospital in Bloomington, Ranger Thornton approached one last time. He pressed something into my hand, a small fabric doll, similar to Martha's but newer, with bright button eyes and red thread wound carefully around its midsection. Keep this, he said quietly, just in case. And Mr. Carson? His eyes bored into mine. Don't come back to Yellowwood. Not ever. I nodded, understanding completely. Some places in this world are not meant for human presence, some boundaries not meant to be crossed. I had been marked, as the entity in Martha's form had warned. Perhaps I always would be. But I had survived, and so had Max. That would have to be enough. 6 months have passed since our escape from Yellowwood Forest. Max recovered fully from his injuries, though he still growls at shadows sometimes and refuses to enter wooded areas, even the small copse of trees behind my new apartment in Indianapolis. I've tried to return to normal life, got a new job, started dating again, even began seeing a therapist, though I'm careful about what aspects of my experience I share with her. Some truths are too strange, too terrible for most people to accept. Martha's journal sits in a fireproof box under my bed, alongside the blackened doll and Ranger Thornton's protective talisman. I've studied the journal extensively, learning about the history of the Hollow Ones and the rituals used to contain them. Knowledge as protection, should I ever encounter such entities again. But there are nights when I wake suddenly, heart pounding, convinced I heard that rhythmic chittering just outside my window. Nights when the shadows in my room seem deeper than they should be, when I feel watched by eyes that exist in some dimension adjacent to our own. On those nights, I clutch Thornton's doll and whisper the binding words I've memorized from Martha's journal, until dawn breaks and the feeling passes. Max always senses these episodes. He'll press against me, hackles raised, staring at empty corners of the room where I see nothing, at least nothing human eyes can perceive. His loyalty never wavers, his protection unfailing. We saved each other in those woods, forged a bond that cannot be broken. Sometimes I wonder about Rebecca Winters and her friend Tyler. Were they real people who encountered the Hollow Ones? Or were they fabrications, stories created by the entities to lure in new prey? I've searched news reports for missing hikers in Yellowwood, found several cases that remain unsolved. I wonder how many of them met the fate I narrowly escaped. I wonder, too, about Ranger Thornton and others like him, those who know the truth about such places but can do little more than post warning signs and restrict access. Modern guardians maintaining ancient boundaries, fighting a battle most of humanity doesn't even know exists. Last week, I received a package. No return address, postmarked from Brown County, Indiana. Inside was a single item, a doll, expertly crafted, with my exact features rendered in cloth and thread. A note accompanied it, written in a shaky hand I recognized from Martha's journal. The binding holds for now, but they remember you, Daniel Carson, and they are patient. I keep this new doll with the others, another layer of protection against forces I still only dimly understand. And I've made a decision. When I'm stronger, when I've learned more, I will return to Yellowwood Forest. Not to hike or camp or flee in terror, but to take up Martha Holloway's mantle, to become a keeper of boundaries, a guardian of hollow places. Because if there's one thing I learned in those terrible nights, it's that the membrane between worlds is thinning. The ancient entities grow stronger, hungrier, and there are fewer and fewer people who know how to bind them. Max will come with me, of course. He sees what human eyes cannot, senses what human senses miss. Together, we will patrol the boundaries, maintain the wardings, strengthen the bindings. We will keep the Hollow Ones in their place, for as long as we can. After all, I've been marked. I might as well make use of it. My name is Daniel Carson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2024, but it isn't over yet. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2024. The first thing I noticed when I woke was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that blankets the woods at dawn, but a vacuum, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My dog, Rusty, lay pressed against my sleeping bag, his body trembling despite the warmth of our tent. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, running my hand through his copper fur. He whimpered in response, his eyes fixed on the tent's entrance. That was the first warning. I should have listened. 3 days earlier, I'd packed my Subaru Outback with enough gear for a week-long solo hiking trip through Yellowwood State Forest in Brown County, Indiana. After my divorce was finalized, my therapist suggested I take time to reconnect with myself. What Dr. Levine didn't understand was that being alone with my thoughts was precisely what I was trying to avoid. So, I compromised. I'd go alone, but I'd bring Rusty. My 4-year-old Irish setter was the only thing Sarah had let me keep when she took the house. The car, and what remained of my dignity. He was enough. The drive from Indianapolis took just under 2 hours. As the urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and dense hardwood forests painted in autumn's fiery palette, I felt the knot in my chest loosen for the first time in months. Rusty's head hung out the passenger window, his ears flapping in the October breeze. I'd chosen Yellowwood for its remoteness. Over 23,000 acres of undeveloped wilderness, with Yellowwood Lake nestled at its heart like a sapphire among emeralds. The main campsites would be emptying out as the season wound down, but what I really wanted was to try the backcountry trails, specifically the Tecumseh Trail section that wound through the forest's eastern ridge. The park ranger at the entrance station, a weathered man in his 60s with a name tag reading Earl, frowned when I mentioned my plans. "That section of Tecumseh's been seeing some strange activity lately," he said, scratching his salt and pepper beard. Might want to stick to the marked campsites around the lake." "Strange how?" I asked, accepting the trail map he handed through my window. Earl shifted uncomfortably. "Just some locals causing trouble. Probably nothing. But we had a hiker go missing 3 weeks back. Found him 2 days later wandering along State Road 46, covered in mud, talking nonsense about some cabin that ain't on any map." I laughed, though something in Earl's expression made it die in my throat. Sounds like he got lost and couldn't admit it. "Maybe so," Earl conceded, though his eyes remained serious. "Just stay on the marked trails, keep your phone charged, and if you see anyone acting unusual out there, best to keep your distance." I assured him I would, though I'd already decided Earl was just an old-timer trying to scare the city folk with local legends. Every rural area had them. The hook-handed killer, the ghostly hitchhiker, the mysterious lights in the woods. I'd grown up with those stories in Pennsylvania. They were just ways to keep kids from wandering too far from home. What I didn't tell Earl was that unusual people were exactly what I was trying to avoid. After months of lawyers, mediators, and Sarah's venomous family, the prospect of not seeing another human being for days sounded like paradise. I parked in the lot near Yellowwood Lake, loaded my backpack, clipped Rusty's leash to his harness, and set off toward the trailhead. The path followed the lakeshore for about a mile before turning eastward into denser forest. October had transformed the woods into a cathedral of gold and crimson, sunlight filtering through the canopy in honeyed shafts. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, not unpleasant, but rich and primal. 4 miles in, I found a small clearing about 50 yards off the main trail near a stream that would provide fresh water. It was perfect, sheltered by towering maples, with a natural stone fire ring left by previous campers. I set up my tent, filtered water from the stream, and spent the remainder of the afternoon gathering firewood while Rusty explored the perimeter of our camp, marking his territory with enthusiastic frequency. That first night was glorious. I cooked a simple meal of dehydrated beef stew on my camp stove, fed Rusty his kibble, and sat beside the crackling fire as darkness enveloped the forest. The October chill crept in as night fell, but my sleeping bag was rated for temperatures much colder than this. Before turning in, I stood at the edge of the clearing and marveled at the stars, brilliant and numerous in a way they never were in the city. I slept soundly, dreamlessly, for the first time in months. The next day, I hiked deeper into the forest with only a day pack, leaving my main camp intact. Rusty bounded ahead on the trail, occasionally vanishing into the underbrush before returning with his tongue lolling happily. We covered nearly 8 miles of winding Tecumseh Trail, stopping at a panoramic overlook where the land fell away to reveal rolling hills stretching to the horizon. It was on our return journey that afternoon that I first sensed something was off. Rusty, who had been ranging freely ahead of me, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His tail, which had been wagging enthusiastically all day, dropped between his legs. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I called, quickening my pace to catch up. 20 yards ahead, someone had placed a crude figure in the middle of the trail. It was about 2 feet tall, constructed of twisted branches bound with what looked like hair or sinew. The limbs were bent at unnatural angles, and where a face should have been was a smooth white stone with a crude smile carved into it. I'd seen enough Blair Witch knockoffs to recognize a stick figure when I saw one. Some teenagers playing Forest Witch, no doubt. I approached it, planning to kick it aside, when Rusty's growl intensified. "It's just sticks, Rusty," I said, though something about the construction made my skin crawl. The bindings didn't look like string or twine, but something organic, something that might once have been part of something living. I gave the figure a wide berth instead of touching it. As I passed, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, like dry leaves rustling in wind, except there was no breeze. We made it back to camp without further incident, but Rusty remained on edge, growling at shadows among the trees. I chalked it up to wildlife. Maybe he'd caught the scent of a deer or coyote. Still, I found myself building the fire larger than necessary that evening, the dancing flames keeping the growing darkness at bay. That night, I dreamed of Sarah. Not the bitter, hateful woman who'd sat across from me in court, but the girl I'd met in college, laughing, her chestnut hair catching the sunlight as we hiked the Adirondacks on our second date. In the dream, we were back on that trail, but each time I reached for her hand, her fingers elongated, becoming twisted branches wrapped in sinew. I woke with a start around 3 a.m. The fire had burned down to embers that cast a feeble orange glow across the clearing. Rusty was sitting upright, staring intently into the darkness beyond our camp. His ears were pricked forward, body tense. "What's wrong?" I whispered, reaching for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees, underbrush, more trees, nothing unusual. But Rusty continued staring, occasionally emitting a low whine. I listened intently, but heard nothing beyond the gentle murmur of the stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. Still, something felt wrong, as if the forest had shifted somehow while I slept. I added wood to the fire, building it back up until the flames pushed back the darkness. Only then did Rusty settle down, though he positioned himself between me and the direction he'd been watching. Sleep evaded me for the rest of the night. Dawn brought fog that clung to the forest floor like phantom hands. I made coffee on my camp stove, the familiar ritual bringing some normalcy back to the morning. Rusty seemed to have forgotten his night terrors and was once again his cheerful self, begging for a bit of my breakfast jerky. I decided we would hike the western section of the trail today toward what my map labeled as Tulip Tree Hollow. The ranger had mentioned it contained some of the oldest growth in the forest, with tulip poplars reaching heights of over 100 feet. It would be about a 6-mile round trip from camp, perfect for a day hike. The fog had mostly burned off by the time we set out, though tendrils of mist still drifted between distant trees. The trail was less defined here, requiring careful attention to the occasional blue blazes painted on tree trunks. Rusty stayed closer to me than he had the previous day, rarely straying more than a few yards ahead. 2 miles in, the trail descended into a ravine, following the course of a small creek. The temperature dropped perceptibly as we moved into this hollow, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy overhead. The tulip poplars were indeed massive, their trunks straight as columns, reaching so high I had to crane my neck to see where their first branches began. The hollow was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the creek seemed to murmur more softly here, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Rusty pressed against my leg, his earlier enthusiasm completely evaporated. "It's okay, boy," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Just old trees." That's when I saw it, a cabin nestled against the base of a rocky outcropping about 50 yards off the trail. According to my map, there should be no structures here. This was protected state forest land. It looked ancient, built of rough-hewn logs darkened by time and weather. No smoke rose from its stone chimney, and the single window visible from my vantage point was dark. Curiosity overcame my unease. Perhaps it was an old ranger station or shelter for hikers caught in bad weather. I started toward it, but Rusty planted his feet, refusing to follow. His hackles were raised, teeth bared in a silent snarl. "Come on, it's just an old cabin," I urged, tugging gently on his leash. He resisted with such determination that his harness began to slip over his head. I relented, not wanting him to break free. If he ran off in these woods, I might never find him again. "Fine, we'll stay on the trail." As if in response to my decision, a movement caught my eye, a flutter of fabric at the cabin's window, as if someone had pulled back a curtain to peer out. I froze, squinting to get a better look, but the glass reflected only darkness. "Hello," I called, immediately regretting breaking the hollow silence. "Park Ranger?" No response came from the cabin, but somewhere deeper in the forest, a branch snapped loudly. Rusty's growl became audible. Another snap, closer this time. "Let's go," I told Rusty, no longer interested in completing our planned route. We backtracked up the trail, moving at a pace just short of running. Rusty kept looking behind us, his growl never fully subsiding. I resisted the urge to look back until we had climbed out of the hollow and returned to more familiar terrain. When I finally did turn, I saw nothing but the trail stretching empty behind us. That evening in camp, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. The cabin was probably an old homestead that predated the state forest, preserved for historical purposes but not maintained or marked on recreational maps. The movement at the window could have been a bird or a reflection of swaying branches. The snapping sounds were likely deer or other wildlife disturbed by our presence. Yet, as I sat beside my fire, these rational explanations felt hollow. Rusty remained vigilant, his attention fixed on the forest to the west, the direction of Tulip Tree Hollow. I found myself feeding the fire constantly, building it larger than necessary, creating a barrier of light and warmth against the encroaching darkness. I considered packing up and hiking out to my car that night, but the prospect of navigating the trails in darkness seemed more dangerous than staying put. My flashlight was good, but the forest was dense and the trail narrow in places. One wrong turn, and I could easily become lost until morning. So I stayed, despite the growing knot of dread in my stomach. I set up a line of tripwires around the perimeter of our camp. Nothing elaborate, just empty freeze-dried meal pouches tied to fishing lines strung between trees. If anything large approached in the night, I'd hear it. I also placed my hunting knife under my pillow in the tent, though I told myself it was just a precaution against coyotes or other wildlife that might be attracted to our food scent. Sleep came in fitful bursts, each time shattered by Rusty's low growls or the hooting of an owl that sounded almost like a human voice calling my name from deep within the forest. Each time I drifted off, I dreamed of the cabin, of approaching its weathered door as something watched from the single dark window. And then came the morning I described at the beginning, waking to unnatural silence and Rusty's trembling form pressed against me. I unzipped the tent cautiously and peered out. The clearing looked exactly as I'd left it the night before. Fire reduced to ashes, backpack hanging from a tree branch to keep food away from curious wildlife, the surrounding forest painted in early morning mist. But something was different, something I couldn't immediately identify. I emerged from the tent, scanning the perimeter. My makeshift alarm system appeared undisturbed. Rusty followed reluctantly, staying so close he nearly tripped me. That's when I realized what was wrong. The forest was completely silent. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing, nothing. As if every living creature except Rusty and me had either fled or was hiding, waiting. I started breaking camp immediately. Whatever was happening, I no longer wanted any part of it. I could be back at my car in less than 2 hours if I maintained a brisk pace. As I was collapsing my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond where my firelight would have reached in the night, stood another stick figure. This one was larger than the first I'd seen on the trail, nearly 4 feet tall with a construction more elaborate and disturbing. Multiple branches formed a torso from which 4 limbs protruded at odd angles. The head was a deer skull, jaw missing, empty eye sockets staring directly at my tent. Around its neck hung a collar identical to the spare one I kept in my backpack for Rusty. I looked at my pack. It was exactly where I'd left it, hanging from the tree branch, seemingly untouched. Yet, when I checked inside, the spare collar was gone. "We're leaving now," I told Rusty, my voice shaking despite my efforts to remain calm. I finished packing in record time, not bothering to properly fold the tent but simply stuffing it into its sack. Every few seconds I glanced at the stick figure, half expecting it to have moved closer when I wasn't looking. It remained stationary, a sentinel marking the boundary between safe clearing and dangerous forest. The hike back should have been straightforward. Simply follow the Tecumseh Trail east until it reconnected with the path circling Yellowwood Lake. From there, the parking lot was an easy mile around the shore. I'd covered the route twice now and had a map besides. Getting lost should have been impossible. And yet, an hour into our return journey, I realized we were off trail. The blue blazes marking the Tecumseh had disappeared, and the path we were following had narrowed to little more than a game trail. I stopped, pulling out my map and compass, trying to orient myself. According to the compass, we were heading north, not east as we should have been. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, turning slowly to survey our surroundings. The trees all looked identical, a maze of trunks and branches and fluttering leaves. The gentle slope I remembered from our hike-in was nowhere to be seen. Instead, we seemed to be traversing level ground that gradually gave way to another hollow similar to Tulip Tree. I made a decision to backtrack until we found the last trail marker, then start again. But after 20 minutes of retracing our steps, I found no sign of the blue blazes or even the wider trail we'd been following earlier. My phone showed no service. Not surprising given how deep we were in the forest. The GPS function was working, but the blue dot representing our position was in an unmarked green area, not on any trail. According to the device, we were nearly 2 miles west of where I thought we were, in a section of Yellowwood that wasn't even covered by my paper map. "Stay close, Rusty," I said, trying to keep the rising panic from my voice. We continued moving east according to my compass, pushing through increasingly dense underbrush as the semblance of a trail disappeared completely. The terrain began to slope downward, and I could hear the gurgle of water ahead. A good sign, as most trails in the area followed waterways. If we found a stream, we could follow it until it joined a larger creek or river, which would eventually lead to civilization. The underbrush abruptly gave way to a small clearing, and I stopped short. In the center stood a familiar structure, the cabin from Tulip Tree Hollow. "That's impossible," I whispered. We had been hiking for over an hour, much of it in the opposite direction from where I'd spotted the cabin yesterday. Yet here it was, identical down to the stone chimney and single dark window. The only difference was a thin wisp of smoke now rising from the chimney, suggesting occupation. Rusty's growl was continuous now, a vibration I could feel through the leash. Every instinct told me to turn around, to run, to put as much distance between us and this impossible cabin as I could. But the rational part of my mind, the part desperately trying to make sense of our situation, argued that whoever was inside might help us find our way back to the main trail. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. "I'm lost. Can you help me find the trail back to Yellowwood Lake?" Silence answered me, broken only by Rusty's growling and the soft popping of the fire I could hear from within the cabin. I took a step forward. Rusty tugged backward with such force that I nearly lost my grip on the leash. "It's okay," I assured him, though I didn't believe it myself. "We just need directions." I approached the cabin slowly, each step an effort against my screaming instincts. 10 yards from the door, I called out again. Still no response. 5 yards from the door, I noticed something carved into the weathered wood of the cabin wall. Names. Dozens of them, etched in various hands. Some looked ancient, the letters worn to shallow grooves, while others appeared relatively fresh, the exposed wood still lighter than the surrounding surface. The final name on the list, carved at eye level near the door, made my heart stutter. Daniel Mercer. My name, which I had told no one since entering the forest. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. Rusty barked frantically now, pulling me away from the cabin with all his strength. As I turned to flee, the cabin door creaked open. I didn't wait to see who or what emerged. I ran, Rusty leading the way, crashing through underbrush, leaping fallen logs, putting distance between us and that impossible cabin with its list of names and opening door. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, until Rusty's pace slowed from exhaustion. Only then did I dare look back. The forest behind us was empty of pursuit, at least as far as I could see. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for breath. When I straightened, I found myself staring at another stick figure hanging from a tree branch directly in front of me. This one was smaller than the others, but more detailed. A humanoid shape with tiny twig fingers and what looked horribly like actual human teeth set in a grinning mouth. Around its neck hung my compass on its lanyard. I frantically patted my jacket pocket where I kept the compass. It was empty. That's when I heard the whispers, not from behind us where the cabin lay, but from every direction at once. Sibilant, unintelligible, like dozens of voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. Rusty whined and pressed against my legs, eyes darting wildly. The voices seemed to be coming from the trees themselves, or perhaps from beneath the forest floor. I caught fragments that might have been words. Stay. Ours. Forever. But couldn't be certain if I was actually hearing them or if my terrified mind was imposing meaning on meaningless sounds. We need to keep moving, I told Rusty, my voice a hoarse whisper. But which way? Without my compass, and with the sun obscured by the thick canopy overhead, I had no reliable way to orient myself. I chose a direction that seemed to lead uphill, away from the hollow where we'd found the cabin, and pushed forward. The forest grew darker as we walked, though my watch showed it was only mid-afternoon. The trees crowded closer, branches intertwining overhead to block out the sky. Several times I spotted more stick figures hanging from trees or positioned beside our path, each more elaborate and disturbing than the last. Some incorporated items I recognized from my pack: a sock, a carabiner, the silver gum wrapper I'd stuffed in my pocket after breakfast. Items that should have been securely in my possession. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more distinct. I began to recognize words, phrases, bits of conversation I'd had with Sarah during our divorce. Private things, painful things that no one else could possibly know. "You never really loved me, did you, Daniel?" Sarah's voice, perfect in every inflection, seemed to come from a tangle of branches to my right. "Not real," I muttered, quickening my pace. "Just my imagination. You said you'd always protect me." My mother's voice now, exactly as I remembered it from her hospital bed 3 years ago, before the cancer took her. The voice came from directly ahead, stopping me in my tracks. "Mom?" The word escaped before I could stop it. Rusty tugged urgently at his leash, trying to lead me left, away from the voice. I followed, hating how easily I'd been baited by what was clearly some kind of trick, some elaborate manipulation designed to disorient me further. We stumbled onward through the darkening forest, the voices always just behind or beside us, speaking in the tones of people I knew, saying things that cut to my core: my ex-wife, my dead mother, my father who left when I was 12, my former best friend who'd testified for Sarah in the divorce. Each voice targeted my deepest regrets, my most private shames. Each seemed to know exactly what would hurt most, what would keep me moving blindly forward, desperate to escape the continued psychological onslaught. It was nearly dusk when we emerged from the densest part of the forest into a small meadow. In the center stood a ring of stones, not a random campfire circle, but an intentional arrangement of 9 large boulders placed with obvious purpose. Within the circle, the grass had been flattened and something dark stained the pale green stalks. On the far side of the meadow was another clearing where a small tent was erected. My tent, which I'd packed and carried away from our campsite that morning. "This isn't possible," I said aloud, my voice sounding small and frightened even to my own ears. Rusty whined, pressing so hard against my leg that I nearly lost my balance. His eyes were fixed on the stone circle, his entire body trembling. I approached slowly, drawn by horrified fascination and the need to confirm what I was seeing. Within the flattened area inside the stone circle lay my sleeping bag, unrolled as if waiting for me. Beside it sat my camp stove, a pot of water already heating upon it. My headlamp hung from a branch that had been thrust into the ground like a makeshift stand. All my gear, arranged as if for camping, inside a ritual circle in a meadow I'd never seen before. The water in the pot began to boil, though there was no flame visible beneath the stove. Steam rose in a column that didn't dissipate but instead began to coalesce into a shape. Vaguely humanoid, growing more defined as I watched in paralyzed horror. That's when Rusty finally broke. With a yelp of pure terror, he bolted, the leash tearing from my grip as he fled across the meadow and into the trees beyond. His sudden movement broke my trance. I turned to follow him, calling his name, when something grabbed my ankle. I looked down to see a pale hand emerging from the soil, fingers clenched around my boot. As I watched, the earth around it cracked and heaved as something pulled itself upward from below. Dirt-caked fingers, a wrist, the beginning of an arm, the skin a grayish-white where it wasn't covered in soil. I kicked frantically, dislodging the hand, and ran after Rusty. Behind me, I heard a wet, sucking sound as whatever was emerging from the earth continued its ascent. I didn't look back. I crashed through the edge of the meadow, following the direction Rusty had taken. Branches whipped my face. Thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't slow. The forest had become fully dark now, but ahead I caught a glimpse of movement. Rusty's copper fur visible for just a moment in a shaft of fading daylight that penetrated the canopy. "Rusty!" I shouted. "Wait!" I burst through a tangle of briars into another small clearing and stopped dead. Ahead stood the cabin. Again. Impossible, yet undeniably there. And on the porch, illuminated by the warm light spilling from its now open door, stood a figure. It had the general shape of a man, but proportioned wrong. Limbs too long, torso too narrow, head too large and oddly angled on its neck. It wore what might have once been park ranger clothing, though the fabric was rotted and caked with dark stains. Where its face should have been was a smooth white stone with a crude smile carved into it, identical to the one I'd seen on the first stick figure. At its feet sat Rusty, unnaturally still, staring at me with eyes that reflected the light from the cabin like twin flames. "Rusty!" I called softly, taking a step forward. "Come here, boy." The dog didn't move. The figure on the porch tilted its oversized head, the movement fluid yet somehow wrong, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. "He stays with us now," said a voice that seemed to come not from the figure but from the cabin itself, a chorus of whispers that formed words. "As will you, Daniel Mercer." "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible. "We are the Hollow," the whisper voice replied. "We are what waits between the trees. We are hunger and loneliness and the fear of being lost. And you have been lost for so long, haven't you, Daniel?" The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. I could see now that its limbs weren't simply long. They were constructed of multiple human arms and legs bound together with sinew and hair, jointed in places where no joints should be. "Sarah never loved you," the voice continued, now sounding exactly like my ex-wife. "Your mother died disappointed in what you'd become. Your father left because of you. Everyone leaves you, Daniel. But we never will. We've been waiting for you since before you were born." The figure took another step, nearly at the edge of the porch now. I backed away slowly, eyes darting between it and Rusty, who still hadn't moved. "Your name is on our wall," the voice said, softer now, almost gentle. "It has been there for generations. The forest has been calling you home." "This isn't my home," I said, finding some remnant of courage, "and that's not my name on your wall. I've never been here before." The figure's head tilted the other way, the movement sickeningly fluid. "But you have, Daniel. Many times. In many lives. You simply don't remember yet." It extended one of its mismatched arms toward me, fingers splayed in what might have been intended as a welcoming gesture. In the cabin's light I could see that each finger ended not in a nail but in a small, white tooth. "We can help you remember," it said. "We can make you whole again." Something about those words struck a chord deep within me, a resonance that felt terrifyingly familiar. For just a moment, I felt a pull toward the cabin, toward this abomination on its porch, as if some part of me recognized the truth in its words. That moment of hesitation nearly cost me everything. The figure lunged with unexpected speed, crossing the distance between us in a single, impossible bound. I fell backward, scrambling away on hands and heels as it loomed over me. Up close, I could see that the smooth stone of its face wasn't stone at all, but polished bone, a human skull, stripped of features and sanded smooth, with that crude smile carved where the mouth should be. Its hand, a grotesque assembly of several smaller hands fused together, reached for my face. A blur of copper fur slammed into the figure from the side. Rusty, apparently broken from whatever trance had held him, attacked with a ferocity I'd never witnessed in him before. His teeth tore into the thing's leg, ripping away strips of rotted cloth and something darker beneath. The figure made no sound, but its body convulsed, attention diverted to the dog now ravaging its limb. I seized the opportunity, struggling to my feet and looking wildly for a weapon. My eyes fell on a fallen branch, thick and heavy, one end splintered to a rough point. I grabbed it and swung with every ounce of strength I possessed. The pointed end connected with the figure's oversized head, driving into the bone face with a sickening crunch. The figure staggered, its movements becoming more erratic. "Rusty, come!" I shouted, gripping the branch like a spear. For a terrible moment, I feared he wouldn't obey, that whatever hold this place had on him was stronger than his training, stronger than our bond. But then he released the figure's leg and bounded to my side, hackles raised, a growl rumbling in his chest. The figure straightened, reaching up to touch the splintered branch still protruding from its face. With deliberate slowness, it pulled the wood free. Where the point had penetrated, the bone was cracked, revealing not brain or tissue, but a writhing blackness beyond. "You cannot leave," the whisper voice said, no longer attempting to mimic my loved ones. Now it was something ancient and hungry. "The forest has chosen you." "Go to hell," I replied, backing away with Rusty at my side. The figure took a step toward us, then another. From the surrounding forest came movement, more figures emerging from between the trees, some humanoid, others more animal in shape, all constructed of mismatched parts and bound with sinew. They moved to surround us, cutting off escape in every direction except one, toward the cabin, its door still standing open, light spilling out like a grotesque welcome. I was hemmed in, with only moments before the circle closed completely. In desperation, I looked to the sky, trying to orient myself by the stars now visible in patches between the branches overhead. There, the North Star. If I could keep that to my left, I'd be heading east, toward the lake and safety. "Rusty, go!" I shouted, pointing toward the narrowest gap in the closing circle of figures. Without hesitation, he bolted for the opening, slipping between two of the constructs before they could react. I followed, swinging my branch to keep the nearest abominations at bay. One caught the sleeve of my jacket, its fingers tearing through fabric to rake my arm beneath. Pain flared, hot and immediate. I jerked free, feeling skin tear, refusing to look at what I'd left in those twisted fingers. And then we were through, Rusty and I sprinting through the darkened forest, pursued by the sound of cracking branches and that awful whisper voice calling my name from dozens of throats at once. I ran blindly, trying to keep the North Star positioned correctly, though the dense canopy made it nearly impossible to maintain visual contact for more than a few seconds at a time. I don't know how long we fled. Time seemed to lose meaning in that endless night chase. Occasionally I would catch glimpses of our pursuers, flashes of pale, construct limbs between trees, the gleam of bone faces watching from shadows. The whispers never stopped, sometimes close enough that I could feel the breath of them on my neck, other times distant but persistent. We crossed streams, climbed ridges, descended into valleys I had no recollection of from my study of the forest map. My legs burned, my lungs ached, the wound on my arm throbbed with each heartbeat. Rusty stayed with me, his previous terror seemingly replaced by desperate determination. It was Rusty who saved us in the end. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he suddenly changed direction, nose to the ground. following some scent I couldn't detect. Too exhausted to question, I followed. 10 minutes later, we stumbled onto a gravel road. Not a hiking trail, but an actual service road wide enough for vehicles. Rusty pulled me eastward along it, his pace quickening as somewhere ahead an engine rumbled to life. Around the bend came a brown Department of Natural Resources truck, headlights cutting through the morning mist. I frantically waved my arms, nearly collapsing with relief when the vehicle slowed to a stop beside us. The driver's side window rolled down to reveal a weathered face I recognized. Earl, the ranger from the entrance station. Jesus Christ, he muttered, taking in my disheveled appearance, torn clothing, blood-caked arm, wild eyes. What happened to you, son? I opened my mouth to explain, but found I couldn't form the words. How could I possibly describe what we'd encountered? The stick figures. The impossible cabin that appeared wherever we fled. The thing with the bone face and mismatched limbs. Got lost, I managed instead. There's something in the woods. Earl's expression shifted from concern to something harder, more knowing. Without another word, he reached across and pushed open the passenger door. "Get in," he said. "Both of you." I lifted Rusty into the truck's cab and climbed in after him, my hands shaking so badly I could barely close the door. Earl put the truck in gear and executed a rapid three-point turn, heading back the way he'd come. "Been looking for you since yesterday evening," he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "When you didn't check in at your designated time, protocol says we start search procedures at first light." "Check in?" I repeated, confused. I didn't have a designated time. Earl glanced at me, then back at the road. "Everyone who goes into the backcountry has to file a plan and check-in time. It's standard procedure." "But I didn't." "Found your car still in the lot," Earl continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Figured you were either still out there or—" He trailed off, leaving the alternative unspoken. We rode in silence for several minutes, the truck bouncing over the rough service road. Rusty pressed against my side, his warmth reassuring. The sun had fully risen now, revealing a perfectly normal forest outside the windows. No twisted figures, no impossible cabins, just trees and underbrush and the occasional startled deer. "What did you see out there?" Earl finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. I hesitated. Part of me desperately wanted to tell him everything, to confirm that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd experienced was somehow real. But another part feared his reaction. Would he believe me, or would he attribute my story to dehydration, exhaustion, or worse? "I saw a cabin," I said finally, testing the waters. "Deep in the woods, where no cabin should be." Earl's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Cabin, huh?" "With a stone chimney and one window," I continued, watching his reaction closely. "And names carved into the wall outside." He nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something. "You're lucky, you know. Most folks who see that cabin don't make it back to tell about it." A chill ran down my spine despite the truck's heater blasting warm air. "You know about it?" "Everyone who works these woods knows about it," Earl said. "Though we don't talk about it much, especially not to visitors. Bad for tourism, you understand." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Earl was silent for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to match my own. "Back in the 1870s, these woods belonged to a family named Hollister. Mean folks, by all accounts. Kept to themselves, didn't socialize with townsfolk. Rumors were they practiced some kind of old religion they brought over from the old country. Not Christian, not anything local folks recognized." He navigated a particularly rough section of road before continuing. "Story goes, one winter was especially harsh. Game was scarce, supplies ran low. By February, folks in the nearest town realized they hadn't seen any of the Hollisters for months. A group rode out to check on them, found the whole family, 8 people, dead in their cabin. Officially, they starved." "Unofficially?" I prompted when he paused. "Unofficially, what those men found wasn't starvation." Earl's voice had taken on the cadence of an oft-told tale. Bodies were wrong, parts missing, parts added where they shouldn't be, like someone had taken them apart and put them back together different, and the walls, inside and out, were covered in names. Hundreds of them, some fresh carved, others so old the wood had grown around them. I thought of the twisted figures I'd seen, constructed of mismatched parts, of the bone-faced thing that spoke with many voices. The men burned the cabin to the ground, Earl continued, salted the earth where it stood, should have been the end of it. But it wasn't, I said, already knowing the answer. Earl shook his head. Next spring, a trapper went missing in these parts. When they found him 3 weeks later, he was wandering the forest roads, babbling about a cabin with his name on the wall. 2 years after that, a whole family disappeared. Mother, father, 3 kids. Only the oldest boy was ever found, in similar condition. The truck emerged from the forest onto a wider, paved road. Ahead, I could see the entrance station to Yellowwood State Forest. Never had a simple wooden building looked so welcoming. Over the years, dozens have gone missing, Earl said. Most are never found. Some turn up, changed, and every single one who comes back mentions the cabin that shouldn't be there. Why isn't the area closed off? I demanded, anger temporarily overriding my fear. Why aren't there warnings? Earl gave me a sad smile. You think people would believe it? You think your story would sound sane to anyone who hasn't seen it themselves? Besides, it doesn't matter where we close off. The cabin appears where it wants to, trails or no trails. He pulled the truck into the station's small parking area and killed the engine. Before I could open my door, he placed a restraining hand on my arm, not the injured one. Listen carefully, he said, eyes intense. Whatever you saw out there, whatever followed you, it might not be done with you yet. Your name's on that wall now. It'll be looking to finish what it started. What do I do? I asked, the brief relief I'd felt at our rescue evaporating. Get far away from these woods, Earl said. Never come back to Yellowwood, never hike alone, and, this is important, get rid of anything you brought back with you. Clothes, gear, everything. Burn it if you can. I nodded numbly, suddenly desperate to be away from this place. To be home behind locked doors with bright lights and solid walls between me and the forest. Earl helped me transfer my backpack to my car while I kept Rusty close on his leash. As I was about to get in, Earl handed me a small cloth pouch that smelled strongly of herbs. My grandmother was Cherokee, he said by way of explanation. She taught me some things. Keep this with you at least until you're well away from here. I accepted the pouch gratefully, hanging it from my rearview mirror before starting the engine. Through the windshield, I could see the edge of Yellowwood Forest stretching into the distance, peaceful and golden in the morning light, betraying nothing of what lurked within its depths. Thank you, I told Earl, meaning it with every fiber of my being. He nodded once, then stepped back from the car. Don't thank me yet. Just drive and don't look back. I did as he instructed, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead as I pulled out of the parking lot and accelerated toward Indianapolis. Rusty sat in the passenger seat, his head no longer hanging joyfully out the window but pressed against my thigh, as if needing constant reassurance of my presence. We were 20 miles from Yellowwood when I finally allowed myself to check the rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty except for a single figure standing in the middle of the asphalt, too distant to make out clearly but unmistakably watching our departure. Even from this distance I could see the unnatural angles of its limbs, the oversized head tilted in that nauseating, puppet-like way. I pressed the accelerator harder, not easing up until the figure had vanished from sight. That was 6 months ago. I've since moved from Indianapolis to Chicago, as far from Yellowwood Forest as I could manage while still finding work in my field. I followed Earl's advice and destroyed everything I had with me on that trip, even my expensive hiking boots and the North Face jacket I'd had for years. All of it went into a burn barrel behind my old apartment the day after our return. Rusty stays closer to me than ever, sleeping at the foot of my bed rather than in his own. He still growls at shadows sometimes, especially at dusk when the light plays tricks along the walls. I've learned to trust those growls, to be wary when his hackles rise for no apparent reason, because I know now that we didn't leave everything behind in those woods. It started with small things. Items in my apartment moved from where I'd left them. The coffee maker switched on in the middle of the night when I was certain I'd turned it off, scratching sounds in the walls that the building manager could find no source for. Then came the stick figures, tiny ones at first, constructed of toothpicks and dental floss, appearing on my bedside table or bathroom sink. I destroyed each one immediately, flushing the remains down the toilet, but they always returned, slightly larger, slightly more elaborate. Last week, I found a smooth white stone on my pillow, a crude smile carved into its surface. When I sleep, I dream of the cabin, of my name carved into ancient wood, of the bone-faced thing waiting on the porch. In the dreams, it speaks with Sarah's voice, with my mother's, with my own, telling me that I can never truly escape, that the forest is patient, that it has all the time in the world. I've started researching protective measures, salt lines across doorways and windowsills, iron nails hammered into the corners of rooms, symbols from half a dozen belief systems drawn in blessed oil on every threshold. I don't know if any of it works, but I do it anyway, desperate for some sense of security. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I hear whispers coming from my closet or from beneath my bed. That same chorus of voices that pursued us through the forest. They call my name, tell me I'm still lost, that I've always been lost, that I can only find my way by returning to Yellowwood. I'm writing this account not as a warning, though if you value your life, stay away from Yellowwood State Forest, but as a record. If something happens to me, if one morning Rusty is found alone in my apartment with no sign of where I've gone, at least someone will know what took me. Because I know now what the Hollister family discovered in those woods all those years ago. Some hungers are ancient beyond reckoning, patient beyond human comprehension. Some things wait in the hollows between trees, between heartbeats, between thoughts, watching and whispering and collecting names. And my name is still on that cabin wall, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2024, and it's still happening, even now as you read these words. The forest is calling, and I don't know how much longer I can resist answering.